Richard Niles on the radio, check it.
So if you were to introduce yourself, how would you introduce yourself?
Well, usually I put like on the emails like Grammy-winning drummer, educator, composer,
Author.
author.
Let's not forget author. And that's another reason why I'm so glad to have you, because I love the thinking musician. I'm going to just mention some of the musicians that I know that you've played with, who I've worked with in various ways. Lyle Mays, Eliane Elias, Paquito de Rivera, John Patitucci. I mean, fabulous experiences to work with these people, and fascinating in every way. But what I want to know is, from your point of view, which one of any of musicians that you worked with would you say that you've learned the most from, and why?
Well, it's a tough one because it's probably a toss up between Paquito, Lyle, and Ralph Towner,
Wow, yeah,
and of course all the guys in Oregon.
of course.
But we learned little different things. But one thing that was in common with all of them is how important composition is. And I'm sure in your conversations with Lyle, he talked about that.
Yes.
And as a matter of fact, he talked about the way he practices. He never said he practiced composition.
Right.
And so when I asked Ralph Towner, for example, how can I improve my solo and aeolas from the one record we did, and I wanted to, get his input. He just said, play the composition.
Right.
So, and of course, Paquito de Rivera has been involved in just all facets of music, from orchestral to straight up hardcore, folkloric, Latin,
Yes.
to everything in between, bebop. So that's all about, it's all about improvisation, of course, but it's all about composition too. And that really, working with all of those people and the other people you mentioned, really kind of set the course for my life, which is now studying composition, majoring in composition at UMass Amherst.
Right.
So I'm in the middle of a grad program, and it's
Great.
it's like it's an insane schedule. I mean, I don't even have time to do
No,
anything.
don't tell me about the schedule. But what I love is the fact that you said improvisation and composition, and of course the cliche that I've heard since my Berklee days is that improvisation is very fast composition and composition is very slow improvisation. So I mean, it's really, I feel that you're expressing that they are the same thing, and they always will be the same thing. And I do believe that when all those classical guys were writing their stuff, they would sit down at the piano, as Mozart did, and they'd improvise. They'd say, "Oh, that's cool. I'll write it down." So I don't think there's any difference between it, but the actual process. And I know you write arrangements for big band and all kinds of different ensembles. The process is different from sitting down at those funny things and striking them. So it's a different process, but it's the same thing.
Right. You just don't have time to try anything else if you're actually improvising. You just have to keep going with what you're doing. Or you can change the direction any time, but in composition you can say, okay, how does this chord sound? How does that chord sound with this melody, for example? So you can go back and change it later, whatever. But in improv, it's once it's done, it's done.
It's there, yeah.
Yeah.
And now, all of these people who I've worked with and met throughout my life, I've always found that they give me something beyond music. And so my question to you is going to be, what musician would you say stands out as giving you some life lessons?
That comes from all over the place. For me, it comes from just every single experience I've had with everybody. The common thing with all those musicians, when it's on, and there's a flow in the playing, and it's, Lyle, Ralph, and Paquito, they all make it look effortless.
Yes.
And there may be a mistake or something, but you don't even notice it. And maybe it's not a mistake. they have that innate sense of music. And actually, since the pandemic, I've been here. I've been practicing yoga. I've been playing solos, recording solos, and everything.
Right.
And being back on the scene is different now somehow. There's something different about it than before. I don't know how to describe it, but there's
I
more
agree.
there's more of a peace, at least in my experience. I
Yes.
mean, I played just played my own gig in Chicago, and I felt like all I have to go do was just go, and the band does the rest.
That's
You know what I
right.
mean?
Yeah.
So I felt this openness. Maybe they weren't necessarily trying to get me there, but somehow the experience with them and to see how good it could be got me to this place. I
Right,
think
right.
that's how life is. It just unfolds, and you get to a certain place and you realize, wow, how did we get here? Yeah. I mean, in my case, I just started to see I was just taking walks. I mean, there was no gigs happening.
Sure.
I was teaching online on Zoom, which was,
Yeah.
is what it is. But
Yeah.
but just taking walks in the winter, I mean, all of a sudden I saw the winter sky for the first time. Like, wow, how come I didn't notice that before? And how
Right,
beautiful,
exactly.
how
Yeah,
beautiful!
yeah.
All these different shades. It doesn't have to be a perfect
Sure.
sunset. It can be different shades of gray or whatever.
Sure.
Just made you appreciate the space and the beauty. So that's, I don't know, something.
I
Maybe it's just
100% agree with that. And the thing I would like to talk to you about, you talked about teaching, and I'm going to ask you a kind of a provocative question and see how you jump on it.
Sure.
I think that, of course, I do a lot of teaching myself, and we've all been involved in that. But my question is, schools can teach music, but can schools teach musicians to be artists?
Definitely, yes, depending on who's teaching. Because I mean, the people I'm studying with at UMass are incredible, and they're just at the top of their game, like Dr. Felipe Salas and Professor Jeff Holmes. Those guys are just so great at composition, and they know exactly what it takes to make it happen. And we may all be inspired by different music, but it's that spirit, it's that spark that unites us all in that. So we're all after that.
Right.
And that may not be in the college catalog or the advertisements or the endowments or whatever.
Sure.
But that's that spark. I mean, at least in my view,
Right.
That's why we all pay these kind of dues to do this.
I've seen from, some of your interviews that you're, as I said, a thinking guy. And it reminded me of something that Matheny said to me, which is that there are all these musicians coming out of music schools who have absolutely phenomenal technique, probably greater technique if you took the last 5 years of music students and judged their technique to 20, 30, 40 years ago, their technique level might be higher. But his comment was that very few of them have actually something to say. And I mean, obviously in my teaching, I do a lot of that side of it, not just teaching the music, but teaching not what, but why. And I noticed that one of the things I loved in one of your interviews where you talked about asking the question, what's the context of this music? We're playing all these different styles. And I love that you were talking about, but they don't learn what's behind the styles, the culture. How do you teach that to your students?
I first try to play them the music and give them an idea what it sounds like, and then try to fill in kind of a cultural contexts like what, for example, Afro-Cuban rumba. That's a folkloric music with drummers and dancers, and I talk about the interaction between the drummers and the dancers and the vocalists and how it's all based on the clave and how it's been adapted to various contexts like jazz and Latin jazz, et cetera, et cetera. I try to let them experience the vibe of the music and try to give them the information so that they can recognize it, one, and then start to listen to it a lot repeatedly so they can absorb the feeling. Because that's what I had to do that to learn how to play many, many styles that I play with Paquito.
Yes, and you play a lot
Sometimes
of
it's the
them.
same night, you know.
Yeah, and you play so many styles, and you are obviously well versed in each one, and you can talk about the difference between this one and that one, and all the details. But also, I find that a lot of times students don't know the historical basis of those cultures and why that music came up that way, whereas over here, 50 miles away, it came up something different. And you find that, I guess, in Latin American music a lot.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I was just talking with a colleague of mine at Berklee, Mike Ringquist, great percussionist, who went down to Cuba and studied, and went down to Brazil and studied. And I asked him about Afro-Cuban 6/8 music, bembe. There's different names for it. So the common bell pattern is tick 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 tick. And I said, well, what about the other parts? He said, well, in Santiago they play it this way, in Havana they play it that way, and then a bunch of different places they played it differently. But the common thing was the cowbell pattern.
Right.
So I try to look for common things, and then if I can get the information on how they played it in this neighborhood. I mean, I'm in many, many styles. I think I'm really scratching the surface. For example, I love this music from Uruguay called candombe, which I first heard when I went down to the jazz festival in Punta del Este. I went there about 7 or 8 times, and I wrote a tune called Candombe in Blue.
Huh.
And a fellow came up from Uruguay and did a clinic at Berklee, Daniel Tatita Gomez. And he talked about the different neighborhoods, the styles they play in the different neighborhoods. And I'm like, oh man, I know nothing about this.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, that's obviously with everything, it takes time. And I think that's another aspect of teaching that I will ask the question, do you think we're trying to teach people too fast? Because they think they're going into a school for 3 or 4 years and that's going to be it. Then they'll know everything. And then we know that was just the very beginning of our journey of learning stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I would say we're teaching them what we can teach them in the time that they're there, but that's just the beginning. And I tell everybody that, this is a path. And you should go out and experience this music. I mean, it's a little different these days because maybe the whole gig situation is a little bit different. There's not as many places to play, but people still find a way to do it somehow.
Mm.
They're just a little more savvy. Like you have Snarky Puppy with social media. People find a way to do it somehow.
Indeed. Well, I mean, that's another thing is I've just written a little mini book for my Radio Richard thing for my people, and it's just called How to Be an Employable Musician. And
that's good.
And it's a cute little idea, but I mean, I find that with a lot of the young musicians that I meet and I do some teaching and stuff, I notice that they don't seem to be that concerned about actually what skills you need to just be employable. And I'm surprised that schools aren't teaching that much. I mean, when I went to Berklee, I had, I was so lucky. I had the greatest teachers in the world. Mm-hmm. But it was artistic. The whole focus of it was art. And the only guy who kind of talked about being employable was Herb Pomeroy, who said, look, I'm giving you all these techniques, but man, when you get into a working situation, you've got to produce results right away. So that's why you need to know these 40 techniques, because you're going to use maybe 25 and 28 a lot to actually make a living and pay the rent. And but apart from that, nobody ever talked about the employable stuff. I mean, do you talk to your students about that?
Yeah, I do, because my background was different than most people. Like I never went to college until 2016, and I never even set foot in a college as a student until September of this year,
right?
Because of the pandemic.
Right.
So my experience was, it was a little bit of an ego thing, I guess. I just wanted to play. I wanted to prove to people that I could play. I just wanted to get out there and play.
Sure.
And that's hardly taking any lessons at all. And that was around 1980, something like that. And that's what I did. I went out and I was on the Chicago scene. I just things started growing and started getting into recording and doing this and doing that, and finally hooked up with Fred Simon, then Steve Rodby, and then Lyle and Paul McCandless through Steve and various producers. But anyway, so I kind of just, I like to tell my students, I've made all the mistakes so you don't have to.
Right. Yeah, I use that one a lot too.
Yeah. And I continue to do it. But what I like to do is I like to try to use students in a professional situation as much as possible. Like just today at Berklee, there's an engineer that I worked with. He engineered my debut record. And sometimes he needs a band to come in for his recording class. And he's got access to the Shames scoring stage, which is the biggest studio in New England. And so I said, okay, cool. Yeah, I'll bring in a quintet. I'll bring in a quartet. And I started to get the idea, man, why don't I expand this to a big band? So I started doing big bands. I just call people, pay them, come in, bring a chart, whatever. So today, great Greg Hopkins, who might have been around when you were there too, who's a neighbor of mine, we co-led a big band and we recorded an arrangement of ours, like one of his, one of mine. And I just started teaching an ensemble at New England Conservatory, and I invited them to come and play. So they got to be right in there. And it was the first session for the piano player. Her name is Kira Thibault. And she crushed it. It was the very first recording session. Like, she just absolutely killed it. I had a thing in the chart, like kind of like I don't know if you know that the old George Russell stuff where Bill Evans is playing.
I do.
The band's playing Stop Time, and he's playing this like one hand solo. I wrote that kind of thing for her, and she just completely killed it. So I love that. I love seeing them, throw down, deliver. And some people were from Berklee, some people were from NEC, there were a few older people, and it was a really nice thing. So I love making that kind of stuff happen. And it's a challenge for me because I have to write the charts and print up the charts and not screw up the charts. And it's a challenge for them because sometimes I bring in really hard stuff.
Yes, of course you do.
So everybody kind of wins. And, I pay them out of my pocket. It's not huge bucks, but,
Well, there's a lot of musicians, so it adds up.
Yeah, it adds up. But we'll make it back in crypto, I guess.
Yeah. I have no idea about that. I'm just glad to say. But no, I found running a big band for, since, I started mine in sort of 1985 or something like that.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, and if you haven't, this is a big ad for Bandzilla, but if you haven't heard Bandzilla, I think you better hear it.
I'm definitely going to check it out.
It's to the left of center, shall we say.
All right. I like it.
Yeah, you will enjoy it.
Did you write all the material?
Yes, I did. I did a record called Slave to the Rhythm for Grace Jones, and on the record I used Yeah,
that was a big record.
It was a #1 worldwide kind of record.
Man.
But when I did the chart for that, it was an 85-piece orchestra with a big band in the center of it. And I had been doing some little big band stuff for years, but one of the players in England, because most of my career was in England, a fellow called Guy Barker, who's quite a well-known British jazz kind of guy now, said to me, "Rich, you got to form a big band. Let's do it." And I said, "Well, I'm in the studios all the time. I'm writing nonstop. I've, got no time, and I can't get gigs. He said, "Look, I'll get the gigs. You write the music." I said, "Fine, okay." So I did, and he did, and so that's how the Bandzilla thing was formed. And then we got a British TV show, which we were on for 10 weeks as kind of like the Johnny Carson band equivalent, which was ridiculously fun. And so I've done, but the problem with a big band is that you have so many people to pay, and sometimes they'll do stuff for free, but I don't like that, and I'm sure that it's a lot of people, and I had the big band and I had singers and I had that's at one point I had dancers, so it was fun. But anyway, that's enough about me. I want to talk about you.
But that's fascinating. I think that's really great, and it's inspiring to me to do that. I mean, we do this because we love it.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
obviously, from a business standpoint, it's kind of ridiculous,
Yes.
but we just love creating things. We love the result, the end result. Like, wow, we did it.
Yes. Yeah. I
Let's
know.
go on to the next one.
That's why we do it. It's that great
Yeah.
feeling when when you bring your arms down and you hear this.
That's great.
That's the last album. But going back to I want to talk a little bit about the fact that you are so versatile.
Hmm.
And yeah, a lot of musicians have said to me over the years, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, people want to typecast you, and in terms of the employable thing, they want to say, "Oh, he's that Latin guy."
Hmm.
And I mean, it's like, I remember when I spoke to Jeremy Lubbock, he said, "Oh, somebody said, oh, he's a great string arranger." He said, "I'm not a string arranger. I'm a composer. I do this, I do that. It's one of the things I do." Does that ever irk you, or?
Not really. I mean, I've learned not to really be too concerned about it. Some people that hire me for sessions just think I play rock and pop. I mean, we get around to talking to Paquito and stuff like that
Sure.
about Paquito. But some people think I just play Brazilian music, and Brazilians have said, "Oh man, you're Brazilian," And some people think I just play jazz. They just hire me for jazz gigs, and
Right.
that's okay. Whatever they want to think, let them think that. And but in terms of stylistic diversity, one of the very first bands I played with was run by a bass player from Chicago named Stephen Hashimoto, and he called it Mothra. And
Nice.
that was a cool band. I mean, it was really interesting music. He had all kinds of rhythms. Like, he was the very first person to ask me, "How's your Latin?" I said, "I don't know."
No, I'll go ask her. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. But yeah, and there were all kinds of people from all over the place in the band. Very, very mixed bunch of people and mixed rhythm. As I thought, all bands were like that.
Yeah.
And I wound up kind of gravitating toward situations like that. So even Paquito's gig, I mean, he's got people from Argentina, sometimes Brazil, sometimes the U.S., sometimes, like, he had someone from who was half Japanese, half Chinese.
Nice.
He's got like all kinds of people in the band, and it's fun. I've always enjoyed playing a lot of different things.
Sure.
I mean, yeah, guess there's a trade-off. Like, if I were only a jazz drummer, maybe I'd have a chance to get more into that language. But, eventually I will.
Yeah.
But actually, I kind of consider it all to be jazz, because 95% of the time we're making up our parts anyway.
Yes, that's
on
true.
the drums. So
Yeah.
it's really, and the Stones talk about jazz, and the Zach Starkey from the Who says it's a jazz gig.
Right.
And if you look at Led Zeppelin, you see them interacting like a jazz band.
Sure.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, there are plenty of gigs where you play your part and that's it, and that's
Mhm.
I've always kind of gravitated away from that. That's why I never got into Broadway. I never wanted to get into Broadway.
Right,
But
right.
if like a musical came up, I don't know if I'd wind up doing it, but I could do it and be happy, because it's a very Zen kind of thing,
Yeah.
and I think that would be the correct mindset.
I
Like,
guess it would depend on the musical too.
Yeah, right.
If it was West Side Story, you'd probably enjoy it.
Sure. Or like, actually, a former student of mine is playing. It was the one who played In the Heights,
Wow.
Andres Ferrero.
Right. Nice.
So yeah, so it could be all kinds of things. I mean, there's a diversity again. There's a stylistic diversity again.
Sure.
But I still want to do my own thing, because it's when you compose it, it's your baby.
Of course. Of course. Yes.
So,
Well, let me ask you about something else. In terms of drumming. I know I'm not a drummer. I admit that fully, even though I'm plugging my book here, which I told you about, which you're going to be in hysterics when you see that one.
Oh, great.
It's the funniest book about rhythm that you'll ever read. But anyway, Radio Richard. Share, subscribe, even donate. I've noticed over the last 5 years or so, maybe longer, this thing about young drummers and what they're coming up with. And I'll start by telling a story briefly about a very fine British drummer called Neil Wilkinson, who years and years ago in the 80s used to have a jazz gig with this fantastic British jazz guitarist called Jim Mullen. And every once in a while on the gig, they were gigging like crazy. Every once in a while, he would just do this thing as a musical joke of displacing the beat by a 16th note. Mm-hmm. And it drove Jim crazy. and eventually he had to stop doing it. But he'd do it every once in a while, and all the musicians in the room would laugh hysterically. But, he did it as a joke. Now, what I'm hearing today a lot from young drummers, and I'm talking about guys from 18 up, who I hear playing around and whatever, is this thing. It's a sort of, I hate to describe it like this, but it is to me, it's kind of an anti-groove thing. It's a thing of deliberately disrupting the groove. And there's this thing, have you heard about it? I'm sure you have because you're a drummer. This drunk playing. Do you know about this? It's called
I haven't heard that term.
Okay, well, the drunk thing, I've been told by drummers, is playing as if you're drunk. The beat is deliberately way behind it, not just behind the beat. It's way behind the beat, and it's kind of, to me, it's an anti-groove. I don't know if you've heard any of this style that I'm talking about, but I wanted to ask you about it because I need to talk to a drummer about what it is.
Well, does it have anything to do with those kind of Dilla type beats?
Yeah, it could. Yeah, it's the triplet against the non-triplet. They've explained it that way to me, that they're playing some part of the beat with a swing feel and the other part is not, against each other. Yeah. And that's a drum machine thing. I think it comes from drum programming. But totally. What's your thought about that?
Well, like all art forms seem to abstract at a certain point. I think that's what's happening with a lot of hip hop drumming, because people are maybe getting a little tired of that's been done for such a long time.
Of course.
So now it's kind of opening up and getting more Picasso-like.
Yes.
So in a way, that's really cool, but it has to be done in the right way, I think. Like, if you're going to do that with everything except the bass and drum and the snare drum, then you can't really move the bass drum and snare drum. You have to move the stuff around it to create that drunkenness, but that backbeat has to be right on the money. Yeah. Otherwise, what is everybody else going to play to?
Exactly.
If they're playing?
And that's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing the backbeat being either discarded or displaced. And it's just an interesting development and a kind of a fascinating. All my life, everybody's wanted to swing or wanted to groove or wanted to make people dance. But if you can dance to this, you need to be in an asylum or something, because this is, when it gets going, this is just, it's not chaos. And that's the thing I find interesting about it. It's deliberate. Right. But wow, it's kind of development.
It makes me wonder if they've worked it out mathematically or if they're just feeling it generally, because there's a lot of different polyrhythmic things you can do to work that out.
Sure.
And I see certain drummers doing that, and that could have some link to African polyrhythms. The way the different drums would be superimposed on one another. Talk about polymetrics.
Yeah.
Maybe not even with the same subdivision. But I hear that sometimes, not quite in the same way, but in certain percussion from like Gorka from Martinique and Guadeloupe. Actually, there's a great example. There's a YouTube video. If you look up Haitian Rara, R-A-R-A.
Okay.
There's a film of these kids blowing through these tubes,
Yeah.
getting these kind of bass sounds, and then they cut to a different film where the kids are blowing through the tubes, and there's and they're also tapping out what this rhythm called the cinquillo, which is tick 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 tick, but they're abbreviating it like tick 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 tick.
I see.
And the hand percussionist is playing like he's going between a 16th feel with that tick 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 tick, and it all tick 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 tick, and then it sounds like in the next second he's playing a straight 5. So it's freaky the way that works.
Yeah.
So there's little things like that happen that like sort of in the cracks. But what I'm talking about with the guoca from Guadeloupe is that sometimes you hear a solo percussionist play this djembe type instrument, and they start playing a rhythm, and all of a sudden you're hearing it a different way. Like, oh, is that where one is? Or wait a minute, is this in a completely different meter? It sounds like it's a kind of a polymeter.
Yeah.
In a way. Yeah. So
I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of percussion like that where you can hear it in different ways. So it's all polymetrics, really.
Okay, so my next provocative question
Go for it.
is, are drums too loud? Now, the reason I asked that question, let me give you the context of the question, then you can tell me I'm an idiot. What I mean is, are they too loud for acoustic music?
Okay.
And the reason I ask that is because when I interviewed Chick Corea many years ago, he said that he wants to hear, when he plays acoustic piano, he wants to hear it acoustically, but he couldn't hear it acoustically unless he sets up the stage with the drummer right at the other side of the stage, and then, I guess, the horn players, and then the bass player next to him, and then him. But he didn't want, because he couldn't hear the acoustic sound of his instruments. Now, over the years, drums have become louder and louder. I mean, if you think back to, the 30s, the 40s. And another little excerpt of this question is that my friend Danny Gottlieb was asked to do the Manhattan Transfer gig years and years ago. And when they asked him to do it, they said, but you have to play our kit. And they had a vintage kit that was much quieter. And they said, we can't sing over a regular drum kit, but our drum kit is nice. And Danny said he loved it because he could play out more, and he didn't have to be so timid, So now I would love to hear your thoughts of it.
Sure. Okay, so the answer to are drums too loud? No. drummers can be too loud, but drums aren't too loud.
Okay.
So I learned to play softly from people like Paquito, Andy Narell, and Ralph Towner, because they were playing these instruments that weren't cut. Paquito's playing clarinet.
Sure.
Andy's playing steel pan. Ralph Towner's playing acoustic guitar with a microphone.
Yes.
So I had to figure out how to do that gig. So, there's two schools basically. Like, there's a school that you hit like you're playing in a stadium because that's what you're going for, even if you're in a small room. And then there's the kind of, I guess you can say it's more of the jazz way of bringing it down so you can hear all the instruments.
Indeed.
So it just depends on which school. I mean, a lot of people in the church world, they get gobos put around them. And, and I've had that situation where I played really hard and had that put around me too. But when you walk in and they start putting it up before hearing you, that's what I have a problem with. We're, in a sense, guilty until proven innocent.
Yes, very good.
I have to ask, can we try these without, and if there's any problem, we can put them back, and usually they don't come back.
Yeah, but I would say you were. I hate to say this because I love drummers deeply, but I would say you're in the minority. Guys like you and Danny Gottlieb, who are sensitive and particularly melodic players, and who are listening players, they're in the minority with just the general rank and file of drummers across America. They're not taught to think like that, and I don't know if you ever talk to your students about that aspect of, if you're doing something with somebody else, like playing music or playing tennis, you don't just hit the ball over the net anywhere. You playing with somebody else.
Right.
So,
well, we're trying to teach everybody to play with dynamics. I mean, it's all about, really, it all comes down to the height of the stick.
yes,
Like if I hit from here, it's going to be forte. If I hit
indeed.
from here, it's going to be mezzo forte.
Yes.
If I hit from here, it's
Yeah.
If I hit from here, it's going to be fortissimo.
Yeah.
And once they understand that, they realize, oh, I have control.
Uh-huh.
But, some students still come in and they put the earplugs in and then they play really hard because I'm a metal drummer, they say.
Right.
And
right.
that's okay. Let's play Humpty Dumpty from Chick Corea, and let's
Right.
bring the stick heights down. But that's why we cover some classical repertoire on snare drum, because then
Right.
they get a sense of having to play pianissimo
Right.
or different dynamic things, shading, embellishments,
Right.
that kind of stuff, and hitting,
Right.
and hitting from high dynamic. Yeah, so I try to drive that home because, and I tell them all the stories about how one of the times I came in with my earplugs, I was playing hard, and we were playing with Caribbean Jazz Project at the Blue Note, and
Right.
Andy Narell on the break, he just said, "Look, man, if you keep playing this loud, I'm gonna have to pack up and go back to Oakland."
Right.
I'm like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
plugs out.
Yeah.
Let's start trying to control it.
But when
And,
when I've said that to drummers, you see, because you're a nice fellow, and because you're an artist, you said, "Oh yeah, okay, I better change my behavior here, and that's the right thing to do." Whereas I have actually, over the years, too many years to mention, often said to drummers, "It's just too loud. I can't hear myself," and they get really angry at me.
Wow. Yeah, that's unfortunate. I mean, everybody has a different maturity date, I guess.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I can't tell you that I wasn't that guy at some point,
Well, I'm sure you weren't.
but
What do you
Yeah.
think? What do you think of drums? Either some people using vintage kits, or these heads. I can't remember what they're made out of. They're quieter heads. They're sort of to emulate the older drums.
yeah. Well, all the drums used to be outfitted with calf heads up
Yes.
until the late 50s, early 60s, and then now it's been plastic. Yeah, you can get fiber skin heads, which are kind of approaching the sound of calf.
Yes.
But I think I still play all my drums open, and I just try to control the volume, with the proximity to the drum.
Of course, absolutely.
And I
Yeah,
think
that's that's the Joe Morello technique, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's
And
what he taught.
I tell a lot of students that I used to play a lot of weddings in Chicago, back in the 80s. How will I know if he
Yeah. Yeah.
all the old repertoire.
Sure.
I had to get people to dance because we wanted to go overtime and make more money.
Good
But at
thinking.
the same time, the grandmother of the bride's sitting right next to my snare drum. So
Oh,
what do I do? So what I did was I learned to try to play really close to the drum head, but get a really intense sound, and set it up so that I play a rib shot, and it sounds like somebody really hitting, but from 10 miles away.
Uh-huh.
And so they danced because the groove was intense, and people could still talk. So that was a happy medium.
Good.
And there have been many gigs where I had to play quietly and try to get an intense sound, because if I play with a wimpy sound with no life in it,
Yeah, sure.
it just would be boring for me. It would be boring for them. It just wouldn't work. So I always work on sound with people I'm teaching, So I work on the sweet spot of each instrument, you know.
Right.
And actually, a large part of what I teach is making them aware of what they're doing or not
Yes.
doing.
Yes.
So if they're hitting the snare way over on the side really hard, they're going to get doink.
Yeah.
I said, do you know that if you hit it over here, you get that sound? You hit it over here, you get that sound. Now it's your choice. Or if somebody's burying the beater in the bass drum, which is legitimate, it's called a dead stroke. I say, okay, did you know that you can come off, boom, and get that resonant sound? Now, which one would you like to play on this particular tune?
Nice.
And, you know, give them a choice. And did you know that if you're moving your hi-hat, if you're moving your left foot while you're playing your hi-hat, it's going to change the sound completely.
Right.
Now, let's see what happens when you leave that foot still. Now you have total control. Now, which one do you want to play?
Right, right,
You know,
right.
So they get to decide, but they have a choice.
Yeah. That's
so I
fantastic.
try to give them a choice. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I always try to talk to people about how complex and sophisticated drummers actually are. Because I think people, obviously the general public, music lovers, they think that drummers are just, you know, being some kind of a gorilla jumping on the drums and hitting things. But there's so much that goes into it, which is why I've always been fascinated. I mean, when I was at Berklee, I spent a lot of time transcribing drum grooves from different records of the time. And of course, there were some pretty hip records. But that's what I really enjoyed doing. And even when I got out of Berklee, I just still did it for fun, you know,
that's great.
this is what Harvey Mason is playing on this track. It's so great. And I transcribed things like, you know, 3 Days of the Condor, Dave Grusin. What a fantastic drum part that is, you know. And, but it's the amount of thought that went into that. And so then I thought it was normal to write parts like that for drummers. And I was surprised when I was starting out that I wrote these parts. And they said, "Oh, well, we're not used to getting parts that are this detailed."
Right, right.
And you know, and I'd say to them, "Well, if it's too difficult to read," and they say, "No, it's just that we're not used to it, and just give me a moment." And and it turned out after a while they appreciated it because it was giving them some thought, some creativity to a part rather than just giving them slashes or boom chick, you know?
Right, yeah. It's a sort of a toss-up. I mean, you know, it's nice to have written out parts, but at the same time, it's nice to create your own part.
Oh, of course.
You know, it just depends on the artist. I mean, I've played on albums where everything was written out. And it was kind of weird. You know, it was like playing a classical part or something.
Right.
Whereas, you know, I like to create something that fits the song, and if they have an idea of the vibe,
right,
then we can talk about it. Like I always ask the songwriter for the lyrics because I want to know what this means.
Sure.
And then I can create a part based on that.
Yes, from the beginning, I've always said, "Here's the part. Now, if you think of anything better, please play it, because then it'll be better, and I can take credit for it."
Exactly.
Yeah, but that's the way I think about it. I'm happy that they change it, but I just want them to know, because I take a lot of time to think about that part, and I care about it, so I want them to at least consider it. And of course, I hire, if I've got, I mean, one of the guys who I've worked with for most of my life is Gary Husband. You know, I'm not going to force him to not, you know, be free to do what he wants.
Sure.
But I certainly want him to have the option to do whatever he wants. But at the same time, you know, he enjoys looking at my parts and saying, "Oh, that's cool. I'll do. That's kind of hip. Okay, fine." So it's a nice relationship. You know.
That's good. Yeah, he's a great drummer.
Oh.
Amazing keyboard player too.
Yeah, he's just. We can't even start talking about him. But he's too much. He's too much.
Yeah.
One of the things I love about listening to your playing is that you're very tonally, you've got this wide tonal palette, and you're a very melodic drummer. So I'd love you to demonstrate the melodic kind of quality of the drums.
Sure, okay. So there you go, a little night solo.
That is absolutely beautiful, Mark. I really, really enjoyed that. The Artistry of Drums, Mr. Mark Walker, everybody.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for doing that. That's really great. I wish I was your drum student.
Yeah, anytime.
Well, no, you don't want to hear me play drums, no. Mark Walker, thank you so much for being on Radio Richard. Okay, Mark, thanks so much, man.
All right.
Really, really
Thank you.
enjoyable. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
I'll talk to you soon.
Radio Richard is a unique collection of my interviews with fellow creators, revealing not only how they do that voodoo that they do so well, but why. So please, like, share, subscribe, and donate so I can keep this channel going and give you this great content. Radio Richard. Be informed. Be amazed. Be inspired.